Isabella's story began on what should have been the happiest day of her life. The summer air was warm against her skin as she walked down the aisle, her ivory dress trailing behind her like a cloud of dreams. Her family beamed with pride from the front pews, and her friends dabbed tears of joy from their eyes. The cathedral was filled with flowers that perfumed the air with sweet scents of roses and lilies. Everyone thought this was the beginning of a beautiful fairy tale, a common girl marrying into one of Europe's most prestigious royal families. No one could have guessed that this would be the last day of her freedom, the last day she'd truly smile from her heart. The groom, Prince Alexander, stood tall and handsome at the altar, his military uniform adorned with medals and royal insignias that gleamed under the cathedral lights. The wedding was the social event of the year, with over 500 guests in attendance. Nobles from across Europe, diplomats and celebrities all gathered to witness what the newspapers called the wedding of the century. Isabella felt like she was floating through a dream as she recited her vows, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. The ring slid perfectly onto her finger, cool and heavy with the weight of centuries of royal tradition. She didn't notice how Alexander's hand trembled slightly, or how his smile never quite reached his eyes. There were signs, looking back, that something was terribly wrong. The way his mother, Queen Eleonora, watched the ceremony with calculating eyes rather than maternal joy, the hushed whispers among the royal advisers that fell silent whenever Isabella approached. The reception was held in the palace gardens, with crystal chandeliers hanging from ancient oak trees and tables draped in silk cloths that shimmered in the sunset. Isabella danced with her father, laughing as he twirled her around the floor, just as he had done when she was a little girl. She felt beautiful, special, chosen, completely unaware that she had been selected for reasons that had nothing to do with love. The champagne flowed freely, and toast after toast celebrated the union of two families, the joining of old nobility with new blood. Alexander's best man gave a speech that made everyone laugh, but Isabella would later remember the strange undercurrent of pity in his voice when he addressed her directly. As the night drew to a close, Isabella's mother took her aside for the traditional talk. With reddened cheeks and careful words, she explained what to expect on her wedding night, how to please her husband, how to bear any momentary discomfort with dignity befitting her new royal status. Isabella listened with embarrassed attention, nodding at appropriate moments while her mind raced ahead to the intimacy that awaited her. She was nervous, but also excited to begin her life as a wife, to truly become one with the man she believed loved her. After all, Alexander had courted her so persistently, had written her such beautiful letters, had seemed so enchanted by her during their chaperoned meetings. How could she have known those letters were written by royal scribes, those meetings carefully choreographed by palace officials? How could she have known that she was merely a solution to a problem? The palace halls seemed endless, as a lady-in-waiting led Isabella to the royal suite that night. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes following her progress, as if judging whether she was worthy of joining their lineage. The thick carpet muffled her footsteps, and the rustle of her nightgown seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Her heart pounded with anticipation and trepidation as the servant knocked softly on the ornate double doors. When there was no answer, the woman looked uncomfortable, but opened the door anyway, ushering Isabella inside with a curtsy that seemed almost apologetic. The royal bedroom was magnificent, with a four-poster bed that could have slept 6 people comfortably, silk hangings, and antique furniture that belonged in a museum. But Alexander was nowhere to be seen. Isabella waited, sitting nervously on the edge of the massive bed, smoothing her nightgown repeatedly over her knees. Minutes stretched into hours as the grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the time with merciless precision. She considered ringing for a servant to ask about her husband's whereabouts, but was too embarrassed. Perhaps this was some royal tradition she hadn't been informed about. Perhaps the groom was meant to arrive at midnight, but midnight came and went, and still, she waited alone. Eventually, exhaustion overcame anxiety, and she fell asleep on top of the covers, still in her wedding night finery. When she awoke the next morning, the other side of the bed remained untouched. Alexander had never come to her. The next day, Isabella tried to speak to her new husband about the previous night, but he was surrounded by advisors, courtiers, and security personnel. Each time she approached, someone would intercept her with pressing matters that required the prince's attention. By evening, she was frustrated and confused, wondering if she had somehow offended him. That night she prepared herself again, choosing a different nightgown, arranging her hair the way her mother had suggested men preferred. Again she waited in the royal suite, and again Alexander did not appear. This pattern would repeat itself for days, then weeks, then months, until waiting became a ritual devoid of expectation. The palace staff treated her with polite deference, but offered no explanation for the prince's behavior. Whenever she directly questioned the situation, she was met with vague references to royal duties and state affairs. She was given a daily schedule filled with charitable appearances, ceremonial duties, and approved social engagements. Her clothes were selected for her meals planned without her input, her conversations monitored by ever-present ladies-in-waiting. Letters to her family were read before being sent, and their replies seemed oddly formal, as if written under supervision. Slowly, she began to understand that she was not so much a wife as a public relations asset. Her pretty face appeared on commemorative plates and coins. Her fashion choices were reported in magazines. Her charitable works were photographed and praised. But behind closed doors, she existed in a state of suspension, neither truly married nor free to leave. The first year passed in this strange limbo, and Isabella's innocence gave way to suspicion. She began to notice patterns in Alexander's behavior, how he would become suddenly busy whenever they were scheduled to be alone together. She observed how certain courtiers exchanged glances when she entered a room, how conversations would shift to safer topics. One particular lady-in-waiting, Sophia, seemed less guarded than the others, and Isabella cultivated her friendship carefully. It was through Sophia's reluctant hints and half-finished sentences that Isabella began to piece together the truth. The royal family had a secret, one that explained why she had been chosen as Alexander's bride, why the marriage existed on paper but not in reality. What she didn't yet know was how deep the deception went, or how many people were complicit in maintaining the elaborate facade that was her royal marriage. As the second year of her marriage began, Isabella started to push back against the constraints placed upon her. She deviated from scheduled routes during public appearances. She asked inappropriate questions at diplomatic functions. She accidentally missed appointments with her assigned handlers. Each small rebellion was met with increased restrictions, but also revealed weaknesses in the system controlling her. She discovered that certain servants were more loyal to her than to the royal family, particularly those who had been mistreated by the queen. She learned which palace corridors were not monitored by guards, which windows overlooked accessible portions of the garden. She began keeping a journal, hidden inside a hollowed-out book of poetry, documenting everything she observed and suspected. Isabella was no longer just a confused bride. She was becoming an investigator of her own life. One crisp autumn evening, while Alexander was away on a diplomatic mission, Isabella executed a plan months in the making. She complained of a migraine and retired to her chambers early, dismissing her ladies-in-waiting for the night. Once alone, she changed into plain clothes stolen from a maid's quarters and slipped through a servant's passage she had discovered during her explorations. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared it would give her away as she navigated the dimly lit corridors, freezing at every creak and distant voice. Eventually, she reached her destination, the prince's private study. Using a key she had carefully copied from Sophia's ring when the lady-in-waiting was bathing, Isabella unlocked the door and slipped inside. The room smelled of leather, tobacco, and expensive cologne, more familiar to her from brief public encounters than any intimate knowledge of her husband. Isabella moved methodically through Alexander's study, examining documents, opening drawers, searching for anything that might explain her situation. Most of the papers related to state business and held little interest for her until she discovered a locked drawer in the desk. It took her nearly an hour of trying different keys and hairpins before she managed to open it, her fingers trembling with anticipation and fear of discovery. Inside was a collection of personal correspondence, and as Isabella began to read, the blood drained from her face. There were dozens of intimate letters spanning years, passionate declarations of love and longing, between Alexander and someone named James. The letters described secret meetings, plans for brief escapes together, and the unbearable pain of their separation. One passage particularly stood out. "My darling James, this marriage changes nothing between us. It is merely a necessary performance to secure the succession and silence the rumors. The girl understands nothing and never will." Alexander was in love with someone else, had been for years before their marriage. She wasn't his wife in any meaningful sense. She was a cover story, a distraction for the public and the conservative royal court. The perfect bride selected not for companionship, but for her youth, beauty, and malleability. As she continued reading, more details emerged. James was an English diplomat who had been suddenly transferred to a post in Asia shortly before her wedding. The separation had been engineered by Queen Eleonora after she discovered the relationship. The marriage to Isabella was the Queen's solution, a beautiful, public spectacle to drown out any whispers about the prince's true inclinations. Isabella felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at the deception, sympathy for Alexander's forced separation from someone he loved, and a profound sense of her own naivety. Footsteps in the hallway startled Isabella from her thoughts. Quickly, she replaced the letters, locked the drawer, and extinguished the lamp she had been using. She hid behind a heavy curtain, barely breathing as the door opened and a guard peered inside. The man shone his flashlight around the room, the beam passing inches from Isabella's hiding place, before apparently satisfying himself that all was in order and leaving. Only when his footsteps had faded completely did she dare move, her legs weak with relief and residual fear. She retraced her steps through the palace, miraculously avoiding detection, and returned to her chambers. As she changed back into her nightclothes, Isabella caught sight of herself in the mirror, still young at 23, but with eyes that had aged decades in a single night. She was no longer the innocent bride who had walked down the aisle. She was a woman who understood the true nature of power, deception, and sacrifice. The knowledge Isabella gained that night changed everything. Though she was careful not to reveal what she knew, she continued her royal duties with a new perspective, observing the court dynamics with educated eyes. She noticed how Queen Eleonora watched her son for any sign of inappropriate behavior, how the king turned a blind eye to the entire situation, retreating into his hobbies and ceremonial duties. The palace was a web of secrets, and now Isabella held one of the most dangerous threads. She considered her options carefully. She could expose the truth and potentially create a scandal that would rock the monarchy. She could confront Alexander privately and demand some form of compensation for her wasted youth. She could attempt to escape, to disappear and start a new life elsewhere. Each path held significant risks, and none guaranteed her happiness or security. For the time being, she decided to watch and wait, gathering more information and allies before making her move. As Isabella's third year of marriage approached, an unexpected development occurred. Queen Eleonora fell seriously ill with pneumonia, her condition deteriorating rapidly despite the best medical care. The palace dynamics shifted as the powerful matriarch weakened, with various factions positioning themselves for the potential power vacuum. Alexander spent hours at his mother's bedside, his face drawn with genuine concern. Isabella was expected to make appropriate appearances, to hold vigils and organize prayers for her mother-in-law's recovery. During one such vigil, she found herself alone with Alexander for the first time in months. The prince looked exhausted, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand in a gesture of comfort. He flinched as if burned, then looked at her with a strange mixture of guilt and curiosity. "You've changed," he said simply. "I've had to," she replied, maintaining eye contact until he looked away first. That brief exchange opened a narrow channel of communication between them. Not friendship, certainly not love, but a cautious acknowledgement of each other's existence beyond public appearances. Alexander began to join Isabella for occasional meals, their conversation limited to safe topics like art, literature, and palace gossip. She was careful never to mention what she had discovered, allowing him to maintain the pretense that their unusual marriage arrangement was due to his diplomatic responsibilities and personal preference for solitude. During these interactions, Isabella studied her husband closely, noting how he relaxed slightly in her presence as time went on, perhaps reassured by her apparent acceptance of their situation. She recognized that Alexander himself was trapped in expectations and duties not of his choosing. The realization didn't excuse his participation in her deception, but it helped her understand the complex pressures that had shaped their shared predicament. Queen Eleonora's condition worsened, and the palace prepared for her passing. The somber atmosphere provided cover for Isabella to expand her investigations. With the staff distracted by the crisis, she was able to access areas previously denied to her, including the Queen's private quarters when the older woman was sedated. Among Eleonora's personal papers, Isabella discovered correspondence dating back to before her marriage, detailed reports about potential brides for Alexander, complete with photographs, family histories, and psychological assessments. Isabella found her own file thicker than the others, with notes in the Queen's spidery handwriting. Photogenic, no strong family connections to cause problems, reportedly biddable temperament. Father's business near bankruptcy, will be grateful for the alliance and unlikely to question arrangements. The clinical evaluation of her worth as a royal acquisition was like a physical blow. She had been selected like breeding stock, chosen for qualities that would make her easy to control. The Queen died on a rainy Tuesday morning, and the country entered an official period of mourning. Black banners hung from the palace windows, public events were cancelled, and the royal family retreated from view to observe traditional grieving practices. During this time, Isabella noticed subtle changes in the palace power structure. Courtiers who had been the Queen's favourites found themselves sidelined, while others who had maintained connections with Alexander gained prominence. The king, already largely ceremonial in his role, became even more withdrawn. Most significantly, Isabella observed Alexander meeting privately with his father's chief advisor, an elderly statesman named Lord Montgomery. These meetings often lasted hours, with raised voices occasionally heard through the thick doors. Something was happening, decisions being made that would affect the future of the monarchy, and potentially her own situation. Isabella needed to know what was being discussed, but her previous methods of gathering information were insufficient for this level of secrecy. Isabella's opportunity came during a memorial service for the Queen, held in the palace chapel for family and close associates only. As the solemn music played and prayers were offered, she noticed Alexander slip a folded note to Lord Montgomery. The older man read it discreetly, nodded almost imperceptibly, then tucked the paper into his breast pocket. After the service, Isabella followed Lord Montgomery at a distance, watching as he retired to his office in the East Wing. She waited until his secretary left for lunch, then approached his door with a tea tray she had commandeered from a passing servant. Knocking softly, she called out, "Refreshments, my lord." When he bade her enter, the elderly statesman was too engrossed in his papers to look up properly, assuming she was a member of the household staff. As she arranged the tea things on his desk, her practiced fingers located and extracted the folded note from his jacket, which he had draped over his chair. Heart racing, she completed her task and left, the stolen communication burning in her pocket like a coal. Once alone, Isabella unfolded the note with trembling fingers. Written in Alexander's distinctive handwriting were words that stopped her breath. "The arrangements are finalized. James returns next month as cultural attaché. Prepare the cottage on the North Estate and ensure necessary discretion. A. P.S. Begin discussions on dissolution options for current arrangement. Time to end the charade." The meaning was unmistakable. With his mother gone, Alexander was bringing his lover back from exile and making arrangements to end his marriage to Isabella. The current arrangement was her life, her position, her future. She should have felt relieved that her strange limbo might finally end, but instead, she felt a surge of indignation. After nearly 3 years of her youth spent in this gilded cage, after maintaining the public fiction that protected the royal family's reputation, she was to be discarded when no longer needed. No discussion, no compensation, no consideration for what would become of her once the charade ended. In that moment, Isabella made a decision. She would not be a passive participant in her own dismissal. Before Alexander could implement his plans, she would secure her own future on her own terms. Isabella began her counteroffensive carefully, building on the network of allies she had cultivated during her years in the palace. Her ladies-in-waiting, particularly Sophia, had become genuinely loyal to her, preferring her kinder management style to the previous rigid protocols under Queen Eleonora. Several junior members of the household staff, grateful for her remembering their names and acknowledging their birthdays, were willing to report conversations and movements within the palace. Even a few of the younger courtiers, initially assigned to keep watch over her, had developed a protective fondness for the lonely princess. Isabella gathered these supporters not through explicit recruitment, but through authentic connections, small kindnesses, and the gradual building of trust. She never revealed her full intentions to anyone, sharing only fragments with different individuals so that no one person could betray her entire plan. With the Queen's funeral concluded and the official mourning period nearing its end, Palace life began returning to normal routines. Isabella used this transition period to implement the first phase of her strategy. She requested a private audience with the king, something she had never done before. To her surprise, the request was granted almost immediately. The elderly monarch received her in his study, looking frail and distracted, but making an effort at courtesy. Isabella had prepared carefully for this meeting, choosing a conservative dress that echoed the late Queen's style and wearing minimal jewelry to project humility. She began by expressing condolences for his loss, then gradually steered the conversation toward her role in the family. "Your Majesty," she said gently, "I have been considering how I might better serve the crown during this time of transition, perhaps by taking on some of the charitable patronages the Queen managed so capably." The king, clearly relieved that she wasn't bringing up the obvious dysfunction in her marriage, readily agreed and signed the authorization papers she had thoughtfully brought with her. This seemingly innocent request was actually a strategic move. The Queen's charitable patronages came with significant budgets, independent staff, and, most importantly, legitimate reasons to travel throughout the country without the usual royal entourage. Isabella wasted no time in exercising her new authority. She scheduled visits to hospitals, schools, and community centers, making sure each appearance was photographed and reported favorably in the press. The public, who had always found her charming if somewhat mysterious, embraced her increased visibility. Comments about her compassionate nature and genuine interest in social causes began appearing in newspapers. Quietly, she was building her own public profile separate from her identity as Alexander's wife, creating a foundation of goodwill that would serve her when the inevitable confrontation came. During these public engagements, Isabella also made connections with journalists, politicians, and business leaders, people whose support might prove valuable in the future. While cultivating her public image, Isabella also took practical steps to secure her position. She began transferring small amounts from her royal allowance to a private account established under a trusted friend's name. She collected copies of important documents, including her marriage certificate, financial records, and particularly damning correspondence she had discovered during her investigations. Most crucially, she prepared a detailed record of the true nature of her marriage, including dates, witnesses, and evidence that she had been essentially abandoned from the wedding night onward. This dossier was sealed and entrusted to her family's longtime solicitor, with instructions to open it only on her direct order or in the event of her death or disappearance. These precautions might seem paranoid, but Isabella had learned the hard way that the royal family prioritized its reputation above individual well-being. If they decided she was a threat, she had no illusions about how far they might go to silence her. The date of James's return to the country approached, and Isabella observed increased activity around the North Estate, mentioned in Alexander's note. Servants were dispatched to prepare the remote cottage, security protocols were updated, and the prince's schedule was mysteriously cleared for the following week. Using Sophia as her eyes and ears, Isabella confirmed that elaborate preparations were being made for a private reunion. Meanwhile, Lord Montgomery had begun making discreet inquiries about precedents for royal separations and the legal status of foreign-born consorts who were no longer in favor. The pieces were falling into place exactly as Alexander had outlined in his note, and Isabella knew her window of opportunity was narrowing. She needed to act before she was summoned to some sterile meeting where her future would be decided without her input. After careful consideration, she decided on a bold approach that would catch Alexander off guard, direct confrontation on her own terms, at a moment of her choosing. On a clear spring morning, exactly one day before James was scheduled to arrive, Isabella put her plan into motion. She sent word to Alexander, requesting his presence at the small pavilion in the Rose Garden, a public enough location to prevent any extreme reaction, but private enough for an honest conversation. To her satisfaction, the prince agreed, perhaps thinking this would be a convenient opportunity to inform her of his decision regarding their marriage. Isabella arrived early, dressed impeccably in a blue ensemble that reminded subtly of her wedding colors. She had Sophia position loyal staff members within earshot, but out of sight, both for protection and as potential witnesses. When Alexander appeared, punctual as always, he seemed momentarily taken aback by her composed, almost regal bearing. This was not the malleable young bride he had married, but a woman who had been forged in the crucible of royal politics. "Thank you for coming, Alexander," she began, using his name without honorifics for the first time. "I believe it's time we discuss the truth of our arrangement and what happens next. About James, about her selection as a convenient bride, about the planned dissolution of their marriage now that Queen Eleonora was no longer there to enforce the charade. I have no desire to stand in the way of your happiness," she told him, watching his expression shift from defensive to confused. "But I will not be discarded without consideration for my sacrifices and future security." Alexander attempted to interrupt, but Isabella raised her hand in a gesture remarkably reminiscent of his late mother. "Before you speak, you should know that I have taken precautions. Documents detailing the true nature of our marriage are held by trusted associates, to be released if anything should happen to me or if I am treated unjustly." This was partially a bluff. Her evidence was substantial but not comprehensive, but Alexander had no way of knowing that. His face paled, and for the first time he looked at her not as an inconvenience to be managed, but as a formidable opponent. "What do you want?" Alexander finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella was prepared for this question. She presented her terms clearly. Financial independence through a generous settlement that would allow her to live comfortably without royal support, a dignified public narrative about their separation that would preserve both their reputations, and, most importantly, freedom from any future royal obligations or restrictions on her movements and relationships. "In return," she concluded, "I will maintain absolute discretion about the private aspects of our marriage. I will never speak publicly about James or any other personal matters that could embarrass the crown." The prince listened silently, his aristocratic features unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before saying, "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" Mother would have been impressed. There was a hint of reluctant admiration in his voice. "I'll need to consult with Lord Montgomery about the legal aspects," he added. "But your terms seem reasonable. More reasonable than I deserve, perhaps." Legal documents were drafted, reviewed, and revised multiple times before all parties were satisfied. The public announcement was carefully worded. The prince and princess were separating amicably due to irreconcilable differences in life goals, with Isabella planning to focus on her charitable work while maintaining cordial relations with the royal family. The press speculated wildly, of course, but the palace's unified front prevented any substantive leaks. Behind closed doors, Isabella received everything she had asked for: a substantial financial settlement, a small country estate for her personal use, and complete legal emancipation from royal control. In return, she signed a confidentiality agreement covering specific aspects of her marriage and the private lives of the royal family. As Isabella packed her belongings in preparation for leaving the palace, she felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief at her impending freedom, pride in how she had navigated a seemingly impossible situation, lingering anger at the years stolen from her, and unexpected sadness at leaving the place that had been her home, however complicated, for nearly 4 years. Sophia helped her sort through her possessions, separating the personal items she would take from the royal property that would remain. "Will you miss any of this?" Sophia asked, gesturing at the opulent surroundings. Isabella considered the question carefully. "I'll miss some of the people," she answered honestly, and perhaps the sense of purpose, flawed as it was, but not the pretense, never the pretense. On her last evening in the palace, Alexander came to bid her farewell. Their conversation was awkward but not hostile, two people acknowledging that they had been pawns in a game neither had chosen, yet both had ultimately found ways to assert their own agency. Isabella left the palace quietly at dawn, without ceremony or public acknowledgement. Her new home, a comfortable manor house in the countryside, felt almost shockingly quiet after years of palace protocols and constant supervision. The first few weeks were disorienting. She had to relearn how to make simple decisions without consultation, how to move freely without security personnel, how to exist as a private citizen rather than a public figure. She maintained a small staff, including Sophia, who had chosen to leave royal service to remain with her, but insisted on a much less formal household than she had known as a princess. Gradually, she established new routines centered around her continuing charitable work and personal interests she had never been free to pursue before. She began writing her memoirs, carefully avoiding any violation of her confidentiality agreement, while still telling her truth about the experience of royal life from an outsider's perspective. The manuscript would eventually become a bestseller, though that was years in the future. News occasionally reached Isabella about the royal family. Alexander and James maintained their relationship with remarkable discretion, the cottage on the North Estate becoming their private retreat from public duties. The aging king passed away peacefully 2 years after Isabella's departure, and Alexander ascended to the throne. Royal watchers noted that the new king seemed happier, more engaged with his role than he had been as prince, though speculation about his continued bachelorhood never completely ceased. Isabella attended the coronation as a gesture of goodwill, maintaining the fiction of an amicable separation. She and Alexander exchanged polite greetings in public and avoided any private interaction that might fuel gossip. They had reached a sustainable equilibrium, neither friends nor enemies, but former adversaries who had negotiated a mutually beneficial peace. Isabella watched from a respectful distance as her former husband placed the crown on his head, feeling neither regret nor longing, but a certain satisfaction that they had both ultimately found paths to authenticity. 5 years after leaving the palace, Isabella met Thomas, a widowed professor with kind eyes and a gentle sense of humor. Their courtship was refreshingly straightforward after the Byzantine complications of royal life. When he proposed, Isabella hesitated only briefly before accepting. Her past had shaped her but did not define her future. Their wedding was small and private, attended only by close friends and family, a deliberate contrast to the spectacle of her first marriage. On their wedding night, as Thomas held her with genuine love and desire, Isabella finally experienced what had been denied to her for so long, the simple, profound connection between two people who had chosen each other freely. There were moments when the shadows of her past intruded, certain formal events that triggered memories of palace life, nightmares where she was once again trapped in gilded rooms, occasional paparazzi who still found her former royal status noteworthy. But these disruptions grew less frequent as her new life solidified around her. Isabella eventually had 2 children with Thomas, raising them with a commitment to honesty and emotional openness that reflected the lessons of her own complicated past. She continued her charitable work, focusing particularly on organizations supporting young women in difficult circumstances. When her oldest child was old enough to ask questions about her first marriage, Isabella was truthful without being bitter, explaining that sometimes people marry for complicated reasons, and that finding one's own path to happiness can require courage and persistence. The memoir she had begun in those first solitary days after leaving the palace was finally published when she was in her 40s, receiving critical acclaim for its nuanced portrayal of life behind palace walls. Though she never named names or revealed secrets protected by her agreement, readers with knowledge of royal history could read between the lines. Alexander, by then a respected monarch in his own right, made no public comment on the book, but sent a private note that contained just 5 words: "You told your truth well." The innocent young woman who had walked down the cathedral aisle had possessed qualities worth preserving: hope, openness to love, belief in possibilities, even as she lacked the wisdom that only experience could provide. The years in the palace, despite their painful limitations, had taught her resilience, strategic thinking, and the power of patient resistance. Her negotiated exit had demonstrated her capacity for assertive self-advocacy tempered with pragmatism. And her life after royalty had allowed her to integrate these lessons into an authentic identity built on her own terms. On the 20th anniversary of her first wedding, Isabella visited the cathedral alone, sitting quietly in an empty pew as sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows. She felt no regret, no yearning for what might have been, only profound gratitude for the woman she had become through both suffering and triumph, and for the hard-won wisdom that now allowed her to truly appreciate the freedom of choosing her own path. As the years passed, Isabella's story became something of a legend in certain circles, whispered about at society gatherings, analyzed by royal historians, reimagined in novels and films that captured fragments of the truth without ever knowing the complete picture. She declined most interviews about her royal past, preferring to be known for her current work rather than her former title. When she did occasionally comment on that chapter of her life, she was neither vindictive nor falsely nostalgic, acknowledging both the privileges and the constraints of her unusual position. At a women's leadership conference where she was keynote speaker, a young attendee asked if she regretted her first marriage. Isabella considered the question carefully before responding. "I regret the deception, not the experience. Without that chapter, I wouldn't be standing before you today. Sometimes the most difficult paths lead to the most meaningful destinations. The answer reflected the philosophy that had become her guiding principle, that even our most painful experiences can be transformed into sources of wisdom and compassion if we refuse to be defined by them. In her 60s, Isabella received an unexpected invitation from the royal palace. King Alexander was celebrating his 30th year on the throne, and former members of the royal household were being included in the commemoration. After careful consideration, Isabella decided to attend, accompanying Thomas, who was both supportive and understandably curious about this aspect of her past. The palace had changed in subtle ways since her time there. More modern security systems, less formal protocols, but the essence remained the same. As she walked through the familiar corridors, memories surfaced, but without their former sting. At the formal reception, she and Alexander came face to face for the first time in nearly a decade. He had aged well, his hair now silver at the temples, his bearing still regal, but somehow more relaxed than she remembered. "You look happy," he said simply. "I am," she confirmed. "And you?" A smile touched his lips as his gaze briefly found James across the room, still by his side after all these years, though never officially acknowledged. "I found my way," he answered. They raised their champagne glasses in a silent toast, not to what had been, but to what they had each managed to create from the wreckage of their shared past. During that royal commemoration, Isabella had a chance encounter with a young princess from a neighboring country, recently married into the family. The girl, for she was barely 20, had the same look of controlled panic that Isabella remembered from her own early days at court. On impulse, Isabella arranged to speak privately with her, offering neither advice nor warnings, but simply a compassionate ear. The young woman's relief at finding someone who understood her situation was palpable. "Does it get easier?" she asked hesitantly. Isabella considered her answer carefully. "It gets different," she finally said, "and you get stronger." They spoke for nearly an hour, and though Isabella was careful not to undermine the girl's new family, she gently emphasized the importance of maintaining one's own identity within the demanding framework of royal expectations. As they parted, the princess impulsively hugged her, whispering thank you, with such earnest gratitude that Isabella felt an unexpected sense of closure. Perhaps her own difficult journey could help smooth the path for someone else. The final chapter of Isabella's connection to the royal family came with Alexander's passing. The king died peacefully in his 70s, his reign remembered as one of moderate reform and cultural renaissance. Isabella attended the state funeral with Thomas, now both of them in their late 60s, dignified and somber among the assembled dignitaries. The official eulogies celebrated Alexander's public achievements, his diplomatic skill, his patronage of the arts. Only Isabella and a few others knew the private struggles behind the public facade, the personal sacrifices that had accompanied his royal duties. After the ceremony, James, still officially known as the king's special advisor, even after decades, approached Isabella. They had rarely spoken directly during all the years of their parallel connection to Alexander. "He wanted you to have this," James said quietly, pressing a small velvet box into her hand. Inside was the sapphire ring Alexander had given Isabella on their engagement, which she had returned upon leaving the palace. Accompanying it was a note in the king's handwriting. "With gratitude for your graciousness, and my apology for what might have been a very different story." Isabella closed the box gently, this final acknowledgement bringing a sense of completion to a chapter of her life that had shaped her in ways both painful and profound. In the twilight of her life, Isabella found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her full circle, from innocence through disillusionment to hard-won wisdom. The young bride who had walked down the aisle in innocent expectation would never have imagined the life that awaited her, both its trials and its eventual joys. The woman who had left the palace after negotiating her freedom could not have foreseen how completely she would eventually heal from those years of gilded confinement. Sitting in her garden, surrounded by grandchildren who knew her only as their loving grandmother, the royal connection a distant historical footnote in their minds, Isabella felt profound gratitude for the resilience of the human spirit. Her unusual marriage had begun with deception and unfulfilled promises, but her response to those circumstances had ultimately led to an authentic life of her own making. The untouched bride had become a woman fully engaged with life on her own terms, her capacity for love and connection not diminished, but deepened by the challenges she had overcome. The story of Isabella's royal marriage eventually became public knowledge, though never in its complete form. Historians and royal biographers pieced together fragments. Official records were selectively unsealed, and former palace staff occasionally shared sanitized anecdotes. A prestigious university established a scholarship in Isabella's name, recognizing her contributions to charitable causes and women's empowerment over decades of dedicated service. At the dedication ceremony, a bronze plaque was unveiled bearing a quote from her memoir. "We are not defined by what happens to us, but by how we respond to our circumstances. Even a cage made of gold is still a cage, and even the most elaborate deception cannot permanently obscure the truth. Freedom comes not from perfect circumstances, but from the courage to create meaning within whatever constraints we face." These words, distilled from her extraordinary experience, became her legacy, inspiring others facing their own struggles to find the strength to write their own endings, just as she had done when she transformed from royal prisoner to the author of her own remarkable life. Isabella's final public appearance came at the opening of a women's educational center she had helped to fund. Though physically frail at 82, her mind remained sharp and her presence commanding. In her brief remarks, she made no direct reference to her royal past, focusing instead on the importance of personal agency and authentic connection. "Each of us has a unique story," she told the assembled guests, "with chapters we choose and chapters that choose us. The art of living well lies not in avoiding difficult passages, but in writing them with as much courage and grace as we can summon." As she concluded her speech, a reporter called out an unexpected question. "Do you have any regrets about your time as a princess?" The room fell silent. This direct reference to her royal marriage unusual in a public setting. Isabella smiled slightly, the wisdom of her years evident in her measured response. "I regret only that it took me so long to understand that the title princess was the least interesting thing about me." With that gentle reclaiming of her narrative, she stepped away from the podium, leaving behind both a legacy of resilience and a blueprint for transforming limitation into liberation.